Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, July 20th. It's also a great pleasure to have with us today Meredith Angwin, who is an expert, I guess one could say, on the nation's electrical grid or grids, and is here to tell us a lot more about that than I'm going to venture to guess that most of us know about. Really fascinating subject that, of course, has been in the news, well, more frequently than it might have been the case in the recent past. Of course, many of us will think back to the rather dire situation that happened in Texas earlier this year when a cold weather snap knocked out power to most of that state for several days down there, causing a lot of problems for folks. And of course, we're seeing more and more weather events happening and power going out here and there. And of course, here in Vermont, we're no strangers to that either. So she has written a book about the electric grid that is really quite fascinating reading. And Meredith,
Should I hold the book up so people can see it?
Absolutely. There you go. Shorting the grid. If this is a subject you find interesting, this is a must read. Meredith, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I really appreciate it. So let's kind of jump right into this here. But I think before we get down into some of the nitty gritty here, I guess, could we have you explain what we're talking about really when we talk about things like a national electric grid or regional grids? How does power flow around the country?
Well, it's basically regional grids. Some of them are quite big. I mean, it has to be regional because a grid, the supply of electricity has to be the same as the requirement for electricity in real time. It has to be matched all the time, which means that every grid of any size has what's called a balancing authority. And the balancing authority balances it. That is, they say, oh, we did a projection, and the projection says we're going to need so much electricity at 2 in the afternoon today, and we will have these 4 plants running, and we will have this 5th plant on standby. Oh, now it's 6 o'clock, and we need more. We're going to add another plant. The standby plant's now on, and and we're adding other plants to standby. Oh, now it's 11 o'clock. We can tell 4 of those plants to get off the grid because we don't need their power. So there's always, you understand that when people say we should connect the whole country, it's very hard to imagine somebody in Wichita, Kansas, who's commanding everybody from Maine to San Diego. I mean, these are, the balancing is done in a region. The demand is in the region, the balancing is done in the region, and then there's imports of power from other regions, but it really is always a set of grids. It sort of has to be.
So that was really interesting to me to learn that, when I flick on a light bulb in my house here, somewhere out there, an electrical grid has to create that electrical power.
That's right.
Kind of right at that moment.
Yeah, it's a little shocking when you find that out. I mean, we don't tend to think of it that way. When you're pumping gas, for example, you think, well, there's gas here, and now I'll pump it, and then I'll go away, and whenever somebody else comes by, they can pump it, no problem. But electricity can't be stored like gasoline. There are really 2 methods of storing electricity. One is pump storage, which is very big, and that's how most of it is done. And the other is batteries. And batteries are fine for a house if you want to be prepared for an electric outage and stuff. But when you begin doing the numbers on backing up a whole grid, like, the grid will go out for 6 hours, but we'll have enough batteries to do it. I mean, it doesn't work.
So, as I understand it, one of the big debates underway currently is as folks within the industry look at what needs to be either changed or upgraded, or as politicians do that. One of the questions seems to be, should we strengthen the overall electrical grid by running more power lines from place to place and making it easier to, let's say, get wind or solar power from Texas to Vermont so that we could have more renewable energy in our portfolio? Or is the better way to go for the 21st century to decentralize things, to have little microgrids, to have people or encourage people to have rooftop solar panels or power wall batteries in their homes so that they, could even be like little power centers unto themselves. But basically, rather than relying on the kind of the big picture grid, a smaller microgrid is really the better way to go. I wondered, do you have a thought on that, or?
Well, in general, I think microgrids can be useful in some circumstances, but as a way for the whole country to run, I mean, when you get right down to it, I mean, I know people who have rooftop solar, of course I do, and some with power walls and stuff like that. But when you get right down to it, they are also connected to the big grid. So if they're having a problem, they're not all on their own, you see? And the big grid can have a big problem, but on the other hand, the big grid has a lot of people watching out for it and so forth. And except for situations like Texas or whatever, most of the time, you get up in the morning, you turn on the light, it's on. I mean, that even happens during a polar vortex. The fear of unreliability of the grid is quite real, and we can talk about that later, but our grid has been really remarkably reliable over time. And if you have a microgrid, you would be on your own to provide that reliability. I'm not sure that that is actually what people want. The number of people who actually disconnect from the grid, put up a solar panel, and get some batteries is much smaller than the number that say, oh, I'm net metering. I sell to the grid when I have a lot of power from my solar, and I buy from the grid when I don't have much power from the solar. The grid is my battery. And the reason that it's that way is that's the more reliable way, and that's all the much cheaper way. I mean, if you had to actually invest in enough solar, if you could do so, and to back up your batteries when everything was going so that it would be enough solar for the night, and for the winter, I mean, everybody talks about a day and night, but what do you do about the fact that, in New England, we don't have very bright winters. We get a lot of cloud cover. We get a lot of, well, you see what I'm saying. How do you get the solar to do your backup for the long nights on a typical winter gloomy day in New Hampshire?
And just to return to that earlier point about the instantaneous quality of electrical generation, I guess one of the issues you talk about with solar and wind power is that they're not always on-demand electrical sources, right? Sometimes the sun does not shine, sometimes the wind doesn't blow, and if a power generating facility needed some additional power kind of right then and there, that's problematic.
That's right. The thing is that you have to have to be in balance. So if it's a cold day and it turns out that everybody is it's in the Northeast and people are turning on a little electric heater in the bathroom because it's so cold, and meanwhile their furnace is just charging away because it's really cold out, and they're using natural gas, and the natural gas can't get to the power plant. You're heading for some trouble if you're hoping that the wind is going to save you, because frankly, every time it gets really cold and stays really cold, one of the reasons is there's a weather system that's just sitting there. And that means it's not making wind. Wind tends to be when the weather systems are moving through. And during the really hot weather and during the really cold weather, there often isn't much wind. And of course, in the really, the solar isn't going to be able to do it all. No, if you go to a dispatch center where the balancing authority people are, and you see the thought that's put into keeping it in balance, and you see how they're watching the frequency, how they're watching, they have big TVs up. Why? They want to watch TV? No, because if something happens that is going to cause demand or cause a part of the grid to drop off because like there's been some kind of accident and a whole bunch of power lines are down and so forth and so on, they have to know that to keep it balanced. And so it is, there are rules about how to run balancing and so forth. And then if you put into that mix that you can't even tell something to go online or go offline, it will do what it wants, and you just go to adapt, you're making it harder. You're making it harder.
One of the many interesting aspects of your book was about the governance of the grid and the various organizations, RTOs or regional transmission organizations, and the role that consumer choice plays or does not play, it seems to be more the case, in setting prices and policies and whatnot. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. How are these grids governed? Is there like some higher authority of some sort they all report to, or are they sort of lords of their own domain?
It's complicated, but basically the levels of governance are huge. And for example, the Regional Transmission Organization is in charge of dispatch, but it cannot tell a power plant to be built. You see what I mean? Only the states have what's called resource adequacy. That is, are there enough power plants? The states are responsible for that, and the RTOs just deal with what the states give them. And so you find things like Midwest grid operator warns of tight power supplies this winter, okay, for example, something like that. Or ERCOT in Texas warns of possible blackouts in the summer or whatever. That's the grid operator trying to keep things going without resource adequacy, you see? Mm. And I have a quote in the book from one of the FERC commissioners saying, if the states want to begin, let me put it this way. The trouble also is that the RTO kind of takes the pressure off the states. For example, if something goes wrong, they say, well, look at the RTO. I mean, for Pete's sake, what do you expect of us? Because there's not, when in the old days, and I'm not trying to say we should go back to the old days, they had problems, and I have several of those problems listed in the book and described, okay? But in the old days, if the state had blackouts due to not having enough power plants, you knew exactly who to talk to about it. The state PUC, which was usually appointed by state elected officials, and so as a consumer, you could be giving there were so many of those outages, we should throw the bums out. With the RTOs, there's nobody to throw out. It's all made by an auction. It's all decided by the rules. The rules are made in closed sessions, and then they're sent into FERC, which rubber stamps them or doesn't rubber stamp them. And so if it isn't working out, whose fault is it? There's nobody's fault. There's nobody you can point to and say, the buck stops on your desk, buddy. No.
Doesn't work.
So I find it's very, at one point, there was an article I read, and I'm on Twitter, and some people are very cynical on Twitter. And there was an article about these areas are predicting possible rolling blackouts during the summer. And someone said, oh, that's a map of the RTO areas, isn't it? It isn't quite that simple, but it is certainly true that there's more problems in general in the RTO areas because of this lack of accountability. And another thing about that is that I joined the well, I was writing a blog, and some people began reading my blog, and they suggested that I join the coordinating committee, run for the position of being a coordinating committee member in the consumer liaison group of our grid operator out here, which is ISO New England. So I said, okay, I'll do that. You know, I really didn't even realize that ISO New England had a consumer liaison group with the coordinating committee, but this guy was reading my blog and he said, you know, you could contribute to that. And I said, okay, it'll be interesting. So I went there. And then one of the first things that happened is I thought, oh, you know, I'm going to hopefully make some positive input here, because I've been studying this for a while and I get it. And so have these other people, but at least I feel like I can be helpful. Well, you know, the first thing that happened was I go to a meeting, and the spokesperson from ISO New England is giving their report on how the state of the grid from their point of view. And they say, and we presented this to our stakeholders. And I was so dumb, I thought, well, I didn't get a note about that? Why didn't I get a note about that? And then it took me, honest to goodness, it took me a year to realize that the term stakeholder means member of the participants committee of NEPOOL. And that just by being a member of the coordinating committee of my group, I didn't have any real input. Now, the Participants Committee of NEPOOL has very strict rules on who can be members. It costs money every year to be a member. For a not-for-profit, I think it's about $500 a year. For a for-profit, it can be thousands. It has tons of meetings. I don't know if you know Don Kreis. He's the New Hampshire consumer advocate of the Office of the Consumer Advocate. But he's written a couple of things about how his small office, the Office of the Consumer Advocates, doesn't have enough staff to go to all the meetings that NEPOOL holds that they feel they should attend. They're not funded well enough to be, you know, real stakeholders, the ones who send everybody to the meetings. And so the whole thing, and oh, I forgot to point out that if you go to one of these meetings, you have to be invited, and if you're not a stakeholder who's paid, and you have to promise you'll not quote anything anybody said at the meeting. So reporters are not allowed. And there's been all kinds of fun about that. At one point, a reporter joined, and then they were like, oh, we're going to appeal to FERC that he can't be a member. And then FERC says, no, he lives in New England. If he can pay, he can be a member. But you are still allowed to say he can't report on anything he hears. He can show up, but he can't report on anything. So it's a very closed system.
Yeah, reading through it, I was like, whoa, this is really weird. I guess I just wondered, you know, focusing in here in Vermont and New England, what are the challenges or opportunities you see that the grid here in this part of the country faces? Are there any issues or challenges that folks here in New England are facing, or the power companies in New England are facing?
Yeah. There are a couple of challenges. The first one is that the grid is going more and more to natural gas. And one of the reasons it's going to natural gas is that natural gas is relatively inexpensive. Another reason is that natural gas plants are supported by capacity payments. And I could go into a whole rant about that, but what I'm going to say is that if natural gas plants didn't get capacity payments, they would have to charge more for their energy. The way it's set up in our grid, you get one payment for energy, that is a kilowatt hour supplied to the grid, and another payment for capacity, which means I'm here for you, just call on me and I'll be here for you. And at any rate, the over-reliance on natural gas is also encouraged by building renewables, because renewables, as you say, go on and off when they want to. and they have to be backed up with fast-acting backup plants of some kind. And there are basically three kinds of fast-acting backup plants. There's hydro, but we have all the hydro we're going to get. You add more renewables, you're not going to add more hydro to the system, fast-acting. The idea is that when the sun goes down or the wind dies down or the clouds go over, you got something that has to come up fast, okay? Because it has to be all made in balance in real time. So, that is a real important reason. So there are two reasons, at least, that there's more and more natural gas. One is that it's fast acting, and every time you add a renewable, you end up adding natural gas because you can't add hydro. Now you say, well, you could add a battery. Well, you know, the biggest batteries that I know of are 100 megawatts. Vermont Yankee plant was considered too small to be viable. It was 600 megawatts. So what I'm trying to say is, yeah, you can back up, but not, the more renewables you have, the less likely you are to actually be able to build enough batteries to do this kind of backup. But there's natural gas. Now, now what is the challenge? I've just described a situation, natural gas, okay, whatever. But the challenge is that natural gas is delivered just in time through pipelines. It is not stored at the plant. Uranium is stored at a nuclear plant, the fuel is there. Coal is stored at a coal plant, the fuel is right there. Natural gas has to be delivered. And all kinds of stuff happens that means that it doesn't get delivered in cold weather. We saw it big time in Texas, okay? We saw, you know, things freezing up and natural gas prices going so high that other plants just went offline. We saw some power failures, which meant that natural gas pipelines couldn't get the compressors to send natural gas to other power plants. I mean, it was really a mess. But if you look at ISO New England did a projection of what will be happening in 2025, they did scenarios. They would never tell you that they did a prediction. They did 23 scenarios of what would happen in 2025. And in 19 of them, some problem, a compressor failure, a major plant going offline, led to rolling blackouts on a New England grid. That is 19 out of the 23 of their scenarios. So the probabilities that we will have rolling blackouts on our grid, from my point of view, just looking at the numbers, is higher than I would like it. Because rolling blackouts are dangerous. I'm just going to say it's just plain dangerous to have power go out to people in very, very cold weather.
Yeah, well, absolutely. We certainly saw that in the Texas situation we were talking about earlier. You know, one of the other many aspects in your book that I was quite intrigued by was your discussion about nuclear power, and you were talking there about Vermont Yankee being a 600 megawatt plant that wasn't big enough or whatever. I guess I just wonder, what do you think is the future of nuclear power in the U.S. at this point? I mean, it seems like, I'm trying to think, I can't imagine a scenario where Vermont would ever build another nuclear power plant. That just seems like politically just impossible to imagine, and really almost anywhere in New England for that matter, and in fact, a lot of places. I mean, do you think, even though nuclear offers a lot of very useful attributes, I mean, it's very, the carbon emissions are very low. It's very, in some ways, very climate friendly source of power. Is there a future for nuclear in the portfolio of the U.S. energy industry?
Well, I would like to think there is, and I tend to be an optimist on that. And the reason I'm an optimist is that I think it has so much to offer for people who are concerned with reliability of power and climate. And that the drawbacks have been totally like, well, they're kind of stated out of control. The idea of nuclear waste, oh my gosh, and really nuclear waste. It's not some kind of green goo that goes all over the place like the Simpson. It's little pieces of ceramic that are kept in very safe containers. I mean, I guess that's what I'm saying, but that isn't the question you asked me. I'm defending nuclear power, and you're asking me if it has a future. I don't think it has a future in New England. I think that with luck, we'll be able to keep our existing plant, Seabrook, Millstone, but there are a lot of people who are just, it's part of their self-esteem that they're against nuclear. You can't, I used to try to convince people with facts, and I've come to the conclusion that facts aren't very helpful, because if people are really frightened of something and they're with a group who all agree that this is a terrible thing and it's worth being frightened of, then you're not going to convince them with facts. You're not going to say, well, look, have you noticed that the actual accident that killed people in New England was a natural gas plant blowing up a couple of years ago? So what? Natural gas plants blow up. I'm used to that. But nuclear is so dangerous. And, you can't. So I guess but I think there are many places, especially in the Midwest and the West and the South, which nuclear has a future. It has a future in the South because the people are in favor of reliable power, and they're kind of don't mess with Texas, as opposed to I'm scared. I mean, I'm not trying to. I'm not trying. In other words, it's not the zeitgeist of the South to be. That building up something like that, and in the Intermountain region, which has many coal deposits and coal plants all over the place, there are plenty of people who see nuclear with its lack of emissions as a really good way to go. And there are small nuclear plants being planned for states in the West, as opposed to the far West. The far West, California, no, they're never going to do it. They'll have rolling blackouts until they're just, maybe it's a point of pride with them to be losing their power all the time. I don't know. And that is, when I started at Electric Power, I was one of the first women project managers at Electric Power Research Institute, which is funded by the utilities to do research in making different types of plants and so forth more reliable and cost effective and so forth, and safer and all that sort of thing. And I was one of the first women to be a project manager there. I don't want you to get the impression that I got up in the morning and I thought, oh, renewables are so terrible. I actually devoted my life to increasing the use of renewables for many years.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now, but we may need to come back and talk to you again sometime about some of this, Ms. Angwin, a really interesting subject. And again, the book is called Shorting the Grid. Definitely one you would want to pick up and read if this is of interest, and it certainly seems like it's going to become a lot more interesting. It's probably been interesting for a long time. We just haven't been aware of it. Thanks again for your time, Ms. Angwin. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you for
we'll see you again the next time. And to all of you out there watching, I hope you found the program interesting. And we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, have a great day.